It's Tuesday, the 13th of December, and this is Politics Live. Joining me today, Shadow Defence Minister Luke Pollard, Conservative MP and former Cabinet Minister Kit Malthouse, Times Radio's Aisha Hazarika, and Government Advisor on tackling violence against women and girls, Nimco Ali. Today,
what we need is a settlement to the dispute, not imposition, and not bellicose statements from the government or from executives in the industry.
There was very little coming from the other side of the House. In fact, I'm extremely disappointed at the belligerence that was shown.
Trains cancelled, operations to be postponed, but the government is not budging.
I've made sure there's a fair offer on the table, but there isn't a bottomless pit of taxpayers' money.
I would love to be having a front page of the Telegraph with a plane taking off to Rwanda. That's my dream.
Those comments have prompted Nimco to say she no longer wants to work with the Home Secretary. We'll ask her why. And we're expecting a statement from the Prime Minister on tackling illegal immigration. We'll bring you that news when it comes.
Hello, darling. You alright? I'm alright, darling.
Is the cost of living crisis forcing women into sex work? Jo Coburn will be sad she's missing all those interesting conversations. But first of all, let's look at the Advent calendar from hell. This is just to remind ourselves of all the strikes in different sectors of the economy and different public services over the next month or so. There's basically one every single day. Aisha, should we just face facts and just pack up for Christmas now?
I think it does feel like that. I mean, it's really interesting about these strikes because, of course, there's the pay and the conditions that people are thinking about, particularly with this inflation crisis. But I think because they're so widespread, they're across so many different sectors, they're really apart across the kind of architecture of our country. It's kind of shone a light on sort of how broken a lot of Britain is right now. Things you really took for granted a few years ago, like trying to catch a train or renewing your driving licence, or all of these basic things are now like a gamble or an endurance test. So, like, for me, I've already cancelled Christmas. I'm not going home to Glasgow. I've made the decision. It's not worth it. The travel chaos is just going to be too much. My parents are quite relieved, to be honest. But you know, I kind of don't blame the people striking for that, because sometimes with the trains, it's hard to tell when there is a strike and there's not a strike because the service is so hit and miss.
Nimco, I mean, it was really quiet coming into work today. Do you think people have just sort of given up and there's none of this kind of fighting spirit to try and get through this?
I think they have, and also the fact that I think it's time for the Christmas party, so I think everybody's trying to enjoy that and make sure that they're able to have a good Christmas, seeing it's the first one for a while. But I think those of us that don't live, don't have our parents in London are going to be stuck.
Luke, when do MPs pack up for Christmas? I mean, their Christmas holidays start earlier than everyone else's anyway, don't they?
So there's still a week and a half of Parliament to go, but there's very little business coming through from the government because the Prime Minister's quite weak and he's not able to marshal his backbenchers to vote for the legislation that he's putting in front of them. So although Parliament's sitting, I'm not seeing the issues that will really address the cost of living crisis coming forwards in the House of Commons. I'm not seeing that real drive to say, OK, we're in the middle of a crisis, this is how we get ourselves out of it. I'm afraid we're just going to see more blancmange-type Prime Minister just wobbling along for the next week and a half before Christmas. And then I think the country needs a break from politics just as much as politicians need one.
Kit, make your political point back.
Yeah, I was going to say, Luke's on message. Obviously been reading his briefings.
Look, still 45 minutes to go.
It's a very challenging time. It absolutely is. And in fact, if you remember back in the summer when I was at the Cabinet Office, we were advertising then that the winter was going to be extremely difficult, not just because of the kind of fuel and energy issues that we're going to face, but because we could see this public sector strike scenario forming up early on. And don't forget, unions now have to go through quite a lot of steps before they get to a strike. And
I didn't have the first Cobra meeting for contingency planning yesterday.
Well, no, there were contingency meetings earlier on in the year, but of course nobody was entirely sure what the intentions of all the unions were going to be. And until the picture became totally clear, you know, it's not absolutely certain where you're going to marshal your limited resources. And I guess the issue is with the strikes is that people are sort of conflating all the strikes together, whereas each one of them separately has different dynamics and different aspects to it. So, you've got the nurses, which probably have quite a lot of public sympathy, but where their demands now are just unaffordable from a government point of view. Labour have said too that they think they're probably unaffordable
so
as
do you
well.
think the nurses maybe have a better case than some of the other
I'm just saying
sectors?
whether it's better or worse, it's different, but also they are governed by an independent pay review body. The RMT, on the other hand, I'm not sure there's an awful lot of public sympathy for them, if I'm honest with you. There will be some people who agree, but most people are frustrated.
So can you imagine a world where our brave nurses get 7.5%, like they're getting in Scotland, but the railway workers just have to stick with 4%?
Well, I think the nurses' pay is set by an independent pay review body, and the government is saying, look, if we have these pay review bodies, we have to stick by what they say. Otherwise, there's no point having them, and it just becomes an unformed negotiation every single year. The RMT, on the other hand, obviously billions and billions has been pumped into the railways over the last 3 or 4 years, and still they are largely subsidised, and they're monopoly controllers of that, and so there's less sympathy for them. And I think the job of the government is probably to disentangle all of those different disputes and try and settle them each in their own separate way.
Look, yes or no, is 7.5% for the Scottish nurses what the UK government should be offering the other nurses?
Well, the first thing they should do is negotiate with the nurses. They should speak to them.
Well, they had a meeting yesterday.
It seems ridiculous that we've had a government that's been refusing to negotiate with these sectors, especially those people that have been working their socks off in the NHS.
But it's an independent pay review body, so you would override the independent pay review body for nurses.
What we say, first of all, negotiate, sit around a table and discuss.
But that's what the pay review body does.
Well, the government is the ones that are setting the final decision, as they are with trains, as they are with Border Force. And so what we need...
So you would ignore the pay review body for nurses?
Well, the nurses' unions have ignored the pay review body because they're challenging
but
it.
the point is, that it was
Hence
set
why
up.
you now have a
it
different
was set up
process.
specifically to take pay out of the political arena and into an independent body to look at. It'd be quite interesting if so Labour would have direct negotiations with all public sector workers every year about what their pay should be.
Okay.
That to me sounds like a recipe.
Okay, well,
for
we've got
chaos.
weeks and weeks to discuss that. Right, who's got some ID on them for our next item? Have you got your driver's licence? Got your passport?
Actually, no.
Papers, please.
No, I don't.
Luke, got your driver's licence?
I do. I carry my driver's licence, but there's lots of people that don't have any photo ID.
Wow.
And that is a real risk.
Yes, well, that was my lame attempt to
get.
get us into the next thing, because have a look at this list of different forms of ID. This is what, in theory, you would have to present at the polling station from next year if you want to vote. You'll notice there's lots of things on there like driver's licenses and passports. Although if you don't have any of those things, you can apply to your local authority for a little special voting card. This is a result of legislation that was passed earlier in the year by the government. However, there is a little twist in that for this legislation and this policy to actually be put in place, there has to be another vote. And tonight in the House of Lords, the Liberal Democrats are hoping to kind of put a stop to it, as you can see from this headline from the I online newspaper saying they're going to attempt to derail the government's plans to force people to carry ID cards. So we'll see tonight whether the Lib Dems get their way. Luke, will Labour peers be trying to derail this tonight as well?
Well, I don't think it is as big a chance that the Lib Dems are saying in their press releases here. This is a bad piece of legislation. It costs £180 million.
Over 10 years.
Which is money that I think councils should be spending on social care, on gritting our roads, on bin collections, not on stopping people being able to vote. In Plymouth, 8,000 people don't have the ID that was on that list.
But they can apply to Plymouth Council to get a voter card, and that's free.
Well, the software to put that in place is not yet ready.
Right.
It costs a huge amount for the councils to be able to do that, and people have to know to apply well in advance. I think what will happen in May's local elections next year is people with ID and without ID will be turned away at the polling stations. There'll be a real tension, there'll be much more friction in those elections. The turnout will reduce, people's experience of voting will be damaged, and this is a solution searching for a problem. In 2019, in the general election, there was one conviction for voter fraud, and yet we have a government that is looking to suppress voters, because this is voter suppression out of the Republican playbook in America, that will stop people voting, reduce turnout, and they will really sully our democracy. We should be increasing turnout. We should be encouraging more people to vote, and I'm afraid this does the exact opposite. But it's typical of the Conservatives that are now losing the argument and are trying to change legislation to cling to power.
Kit, you can fight back in a second. Nimco?
Well, I'm not fighting back on behalf of the government, but I have to say this is about strengthening democracy. I come from a country called Somaliland where we have iris technology in order to be able to be voted. So I think this idea of the fact
And you think that's good?
I think it is good. I think the fact that, the ID makes it less democratic is actually kind of a fallacy, and ultimately any money spent in order to strengthen our democracy is actually worth it.
Aisha, we're old enough to remember going to Blockbuster Video and you had to show a card to rent like a Julia Roberts film. Surely we should have at least that for voting.
I think voting is slightly different from renting a Julia Roberts film. I do agree with what Luke said, and I think the really sad thing about this, it does feel like it's a bit of a last gasp from a Conservative Party that is ready really to be a kind of an opposition in waiting, and kind of changing the rules and suppressing votes.
What do you think? They're trying to sort of find a way of making Labour voters not be able to vote.
Because,
you think it's as sort of American gerrymandering voter suppression-y as that?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at the types of people who will not be wanting to sort of do this, it will be younger people, people from ethnic minority backgrounds, people who are very economically marginalised. As Luke was saying, the idea that you would have to sort of apply to get something. People are really busy at the moment. People have a lot going on. The idea, I mean, people can't even get their sort of driving licences because the system is so broken. The other thing which is really interesting is the sort of discrimination against young people. So when you look at that list of the types of ID that can be used, an over 60 person can use their Oyster card. A young person is not allowed to do that. So it does feel that there is not even an implicit, an explicit bias towards the types of people who still might, the few people who might still vote Conservative.
Nimco?
No, I was going to say, I think it's really interesting that the Labour Party are very struck by this, because coming from some community that ultimately is a Labour voting community, I think this basically means that Labour were going to have to fight for votes that they get at the moment. So I actually think this is something...
Sorry, how? It's just about how people put the cross in the...
Well, I don't know. So I can kind of say the fact that, a lot of the people that put the crosses in those things, whether it's postal votes or whatever it is, or you can have a family that has 11 votes in one household, and I don't necessarily think that every 11 person in those houses actually do technically vote.
But if that was a genuine problem, don't you think we would have had some crimes prosecuted as a result?
But nobody's complaining. So I think at the moment, what these photo IDs are going to do is actually...
They have been complaining because the Tories have been raising this as an issue, and there's only been one prosecution.
Well, no, I think ultimately, so if the numbers go down in terms of the fact that when these voter IDs come in, then we can actually have a conversation about whether these votes actually existed, or whether people that are poor and from certain communities are being taken out of the voting pool.
Wouldn't it be better to investigate the claims of fraud rather than stopping people voting and sort of doing an experiment that way?
But the fraud is not going to come out, because the communities that are, having the fraud committed against them are communities that don't actually know what's committed, what's happening at the moment. So whether we look at Tower Hamlet or places in Wales and so on, I know that a lot of these votes are stolen for the Labour Party, in the sense that...
You say stolen?
So, for example, I'll give you an example. So when I stood for election for the Women's Equality Party, I wasn't intending on winning. I had a...
don't name any names or anything here, or name any names here, or make any sort of...
I'm not naming any names. I'm just telling you the fact that there was a guy that came to me and saying, I've got 11 votes in my house, and this is what I mean about the 11 votes. He said, I'll give 5 to Labour and 6 to the Women's Equality Party, kind of thing. I'm like, but I've never even met 6 of these people that are going to vote for me. So the reality is that there are these things where people are having multiple votes in multiple houses, and those people are not going out to vote. So ultimately, whether you're going to have the postal vote or go out to vote, I think this is going to make it a lot more democratic. And I say that... I know it doesn't cover, but I'm just saying, at the moment, the whole conversation is that if people are going to go forward, but I think we need to extend it to postal votes as well, because I don't necessarily think...
But we've just been talking about going to... So the example you've given is... It should be investigated, but that is a very different thing. This is about people going in person to a polling station. That is a very different example to the one that we've just been talking about. So you cannot use a different example to fundamentally change the democratic system.
Where, when I was voting in Primrose Hill last year, there were people that were standing outside telling people how to vote and what the Labour candidates on the ballot look like. So
that's electioneering, though,
that's electioneering, but this is what I'm saying to you, is the whole point is that people are voting for Labour, not necessarily knowing who they're voting for, and you actually don't know who's coming to vote.
But we can't change the electoral system based on a few anecdotes.
I'm not saying, Andy, so I'm
everything needs to be properly investigated. investigate. I'm from a Muslim community as well. We've had these allegations made against us as well. It has to be properly investigated. If there is electoral fraud, it must be rooted out, it must be prosecuted. They have tried to do it, only one prosecution. We live in a world where we're saying to people that we should get more people to vote. It's really important, particularly young people. And by the way, if you look at actually the electoral register, a lot of people are missed off the electoral register because they're transient, they're renting, they're moving around a lot.
Let's put all that to Kit then, because I mean, you were involved in this legislation a bit, weren't you?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, look, lots of countries around the world have voter ID. And it doesn't impact on the participation in the democratic process. So it feels to me a bit of a confected row. I mean, we obviously have it I think it's been in existence in Northern Ireland for some time. There were pilots that run that didn't impact on the numbers. I think there's quite a lot of people that show up to the polling booth. They're quite surprised at it. That's why they bring their little card with them.
But what's the evidence that it's an actual problem?
Well, there have been allegations of incidents of voter fraud over the time. But at the same time, you always have to pay attention to the integrity of a democratic process. And, the advent, for example, of postal votes did increase participation quite a lot, as far as I can see. Certainly in my constituency, it did. And if we want to try and increase participation, get more and more people voting, we also have to think about the integrity of the system. Now, as you say, you have to show your IT card in lots of other places. And as I say, it comes as quite a surprise, certainly when you talk to other countries, that you don't have to when you vote.
Well, talking about I was going to say, talking about the implementation, that was the subject of a piece in the Financial Times where the headline says the Electoral Commission, the people who actually have to run the elections, warns of problems with the UK's new voter ID, and some of the returning officers are concerned as well. Do you think the system is ready for this to be in place for the local elections in May next year?
You're asking me a question I don't know the answer to. I mean, in the end, you'd have to get the ministers on who are in charge of it. But they have to. But the integrity also relies on the system working, right? So they need to make sure, having tested it, having piloted it, having it working in Northern Ireland, that they're able to implement it in a sensible way. And Big Bang might not be a sensible way. Maybe they need to do it region by region.
You'd be open to a delay.
There's no evidence that it reduces participation. There's lots of evidence that it's reassuring to people. And, lots of countries have it. It doesn't seem an unusual thing for us to do.
The chances of your ID being taken from you in a general election are the same as you being hit by lightning 53 times in a row. Right, so this is a solution searching for a problem. This will reduce turnout. That's what the pilots did show. And it will especially reduce turnout under certain communities that are more likely to vote Labour, but also in rural communities, because there'll be lots of people who will go to a polling station, be told that they didn't have the ID and not come back because they can't just walk around the corner because they've travelled long distances to get there. I'm afraid this is voter suppression, and we should be calling it out for what it is, because other countries that may have photo ID have compulsory photo ID for every citizen anyway. We don't. And if we have a list that only favours the more Tory-leaning demographics versus those that may vote for other parties, then it's a partisan measure. And I think we should all be looking at it going, is this right? Because if Labour were doing this to favour Labour voting demographics, to make it harder for Tory voting demographics to vote, I think you'd be the first person to call it out.
OK, so let's see how the Lib Dems get on in the House of Lords tonight, whether they can stymie this or at least delay it for a little bit longer. Right, one of our panellists was the subject of a big story in the Times a couple of days ago after she dramatically resigned as an advisor to the Home Secretary, live on a rival radio station. It was Nimco. So,
a very good radio station.
what makes it? It wasn't on your show, though, was it?
No, it wasn't.
Nimco, so why are you leaving the Home Office then?
So I said I wasn't going to continue my contract because I just felt uncomfortable with the way that the leadership at the Home Office was actually talking about people like me, which I said on the station at the time.
What particular phrases and comments was it?
I think the whole thing about looking at invasions, and I think the inhumanity that we're facing towards refugees is not necessarily something that I'm comfortable with as a child refugee myself. I think we can have a rigorous system, but that rigorous system can still have kindness and humanity at the heart of it.
So it's the language and the system?
I think it's the language and the inability for us to be able to see the fact that we need to fix things and make things more humane, as opposed to just trying to be more and more kind of hardline. I think because of Brexit and other things that have happened over the last 3 years, I think we've kind of gone to this very Trumpian era where we have to sound more and more hateful in order to sound more and more patriotic. And I don't think that's what I don't think that's what Britain's about.
But you talked about the last 3 years and Brexit. I mean, that was it during your tenure when you were happy to do this job.
But no, but the whole point is the conversation around immigration wasn't as as hard as it was at the moment. So the whole point is that the previous Home Secretary wasn't calling people that are looking for safety as invading the country. And I think the whole point is that we don't necessarily have to have these conversations. I do believe that a country has to have safe borders, and they can put in the legislation that they need, but that legislation has to be able to be something that is humane and supportive of those that are fleeing for safety.
How different is Suella Braverman, the current Home Secretary, from Priti Patel, the previous Home Secretary?
I have to be honest, I've worked very well with Priti Patel and I know her quite well, so I haven't met Suella formally anyway. But I just think in terms of the conversation...
Oh, so you've not even had a conversation with her? Maybe she could explain what she meant and that might have changed your mind.
I think she might be able to explain what she meant, but I don't think it's going to change my mind. I think I'm very much committed to ending violence against women and girls, and I do think actually this is something that needs to stop being political and actually has to be instrumental. I said in the interview that a lot of the civil servants that I work with, and Kit, when I worked with him at the Home Office, were very much committed to making real changes, and I want that to be at the core of it. But I think ultimately as well, we've had 3 pieces of legislation which I was very much behind passed, and I think I've done my duty for now anyway. And
just to be clear, so you're going to serve out your contract and not seek for it to be renewed, rather than sort of resign and walk out?
I'm just not working on this tenure, essentially.
OK. Kit, I mean, does some of that ring true for you? I mean, you used to be in the Home Office under the old regime. There's a new regime now.
Yeah, there is. I mean, Nimco's right that politicians always have to be careful about their rhetoric, particularly in sensitive areas like this. And I agree with it. I mean, one of the things I tried to do, for example, at the Home Office, was eradicate the use of the word crackdown. I think the public become fed up of constantly promised crackdowns which never kind of deliver. And I hope
the Prime Minister might be about to announce one right now.
Well, let's hope he doesn't use that word, right? But and when you get a crisis, and it is a crisis that we're facing in the Channel at the moment, right? The temptation is to kind of ramp up the rhetoric in advance of any kind of delivery. And yet, what we're learning, aren't we? Painfully, is that this is a very complicated problem to which there are going to be lots and lots of different solutions. And frankly, I would much rather they were smart solutions than tough solutions. You know, smart, in my view, beats tough every time. And I think the British public would welcome a kind of more thoughtful, measured, kind of smart approach towards the problem in the Channel than just, constantly ramping up the rhetoric, if I'm honest with you.
Is the evidence then so far that the Suella Braverman Home Office is tough but not smart?
Well, I don't know. Let's see what gets announced today, right? I mean, I'm sure they've been beavering away. I gather, certainly for the papers, that there's been a deal with Albania, or there may be a deal with Albania, which would be very welcome. You know, we are one of the few European countries that has this problem from a NATO ally, and so if there's a sensible solution there, then great. But as I say, the smarter they can be about dealing with this issue, in many ways, you know, many of our problems at the Home Office require smarts rather than tough. To get to the root of them.
We played the clip of Suella Braverman at the Tory Party conference talking about how she dreams of seeing the Telegraph front page with a picture of a plane taking people to Rwanda as part of that policy. Was that a smart thing for her to say?
Well, I would imagine she misspoke. It's not language that I would have used.
I don't think she says she misspoke. I think she says it was fairly...
Well, as I say...
What do you think it revealed about her?
I certainly wouldn't have been my dream.
Really?
No. I don't think anybody...
Are you opposed to the Rwanda policy?
Sorry?
Are you opposed to the Rwanda policy?
I could
you
see...
Just dream about you.
I think there needs to be some kind of general returns policy that removes the incentive for people crossing. But it's more complicated than that, because you've got to remember you are dealing effectively with a business here. There are people making profit from this. And if you think of it as a business, you've got to realise that if you raise the risk, effectively, the business may respond by just changing its price or doing things differently. Remembering, of course, that the reason that we have such a problem in the Channel is that we were so successful at closing off the route through the tunnel. If you remember, not very long ago, that was a huge problem with people coming through the tunnel. Huge effort was put into closing that down.
Oh, yeah, it's like a military facility.
Well, exactly. The gangs then twigged that actually coming across the Channel in a small boat was a relatively easy thing to do. And so you see a flow of people coming that way. And so let's hope the same smarts that closed off the tunnel are able to close off the Channel as well.
Aisha, not as a former Labour advisor, but as an observer and a commentator, what do you think that conversation there reveals about the tensions in the Conservative Party about this issue?
Well, I think post-Brexit immigration has been a great sense of tension in the Conservative Party. I think where most people are is that, you know, they believe in having managed borders, but actually believe people should be able to come to this country in a way which is controlled to contribute economically. And of course, for us to honour our international obligations in terms of taking in refugees. And I just feel that the language that has been used over, not just Suella Braverman, before that, Priti Patel as well, you know, I think it makes a good point, you know, smart solutions rather than fantastical, you know, weird, you know, talking tough. I mean, when Priti Patel was there, we had some crazy ideas being floated. At one point, they were talking about a wave machine, like creating some big general. You can see it's
Were
like
those ideas actually floated?
I mean, there was some. If you pardon the pun.
Luckily for you.
I mean, so you know, what this requires, I mean, you cannot have quick solutions to this. They're very, very complicated. They're rooted in things, by the way, we might not want to talk about, but there's things like climate migration, there's look, you're not going to stop these waves of immigration. You have to have these sensible conversations. And the language, and I agree with Nimco, the language of invasion, that does nothing to calm things down. It just flares everything.
Well, do you know what? I was going to say,
for the people we have, but for the people who we have brought over with these, we need more safe and legal routes. But even the routes we've had, like Afghanistan, we still have left people behind in Afghanistan. We still haven't rehoused as many people. We've got to get a grip on this.
Okay. But, I mean, it's worth saying. I know there's always the link to Brexit, where this was the moment at which. But since then, obviously, there have been a huge number of refugees who come. Afghanistan, as you said, you know, Hong Kong, Ukraine. Right? I don't think anybody can point to the country and say we've not been generous.
Rhetoric. It's this idea, the fact that the Conservative Party had to fight with Nigel Farage and such hateful figures, and in order to become more.
No, but I don't think there's anybody in politics who doesn't think that you should have a controlled system of immigration, whether it's asylum, refugees, or just people coming for general immigration.
It's the language. So we're talking about the language.
So having a sense of control, and as I said, you know, language is very important in these areas. But the idea that somehow we haven't been welcoming to refugees, despite the tens of thousands that have come.
Okay, well, you know what? We're all talking about,
and where the problem is coming is not from the idea of refugees per se or asylum seekers per se. It's the fact that this route, this incredibly dangerous route, which is being exploited by criminals, has become so prominent over the last just 3 or 4 years that is raising the temperature.
Right, let's do some live rhetorical analysis now, because Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, has just been speaking in the House of Commons about his new migration announcement, and here is a little flavour of it.
No one can doubt our generosity of spirit. But today, far too many of the beneficiaries of that generosity are not those directly fleeing war zones or at risk of persecution, but people crossing the Channel in small boats. Many originate from fundamentally safe countries. All travel through safe countries.
Look, lots of rhetoric, not a lot of detail there. Do you want to react to what we think we've just heard from the government?
Well, I hope we're going to get a sensible, clear plan from the government and not the sets of promises and exaggerations we've had in the past. In October 2019, just around the time of the last general election, Priti Patel promised that she would sort out the small boats crisis within 6 months. Similar promises have been made ever since. What's clear is that this is difficult and complicated, and the public deserve better than being taken for fools with this over-exaggerated language. I hope that the Prime Minister adopts the policy set out by Yvette Cooper, Labour's Shadow Home Secretary this week, of having a fast-track processing for those people coming from Albania, because Britain should have a welcoming asylum and immigration system to support people fleeing conflict and persecution. But we should also be really clear that some of the folks that may be coming over don't fall into that category, so they should be processed quickly and returned, because many of the countries that are dealing with Albanian immigration in this particular case have dealt with it. The UK has not adopted the same policies that would have resolved these issues many years ago, and that's what I hope will be coming out from the government here.
Okay. To be fair, the growth in Albanians has really just been in the last 12 months, right? And so we're...
What did you do about it 12 months ago?
This is a new phenomenon. The numbers were quite small. This is a new phenomenon over the last...
Why did you not see it coming then?
Well, as I say, I wasn't involved with that side of the business, but at the same time,
Okay.
you know, as Luke says, this is a complicated problem that requires solutions. You've also got to bear in mind that whenever you put in place a solution, you know, behaviour changes. So, for example, when Rwanda was first announced, I think they saw a number of people landing on the beach and not claiming asylum, just arriving as illegal immigrants, who were then effectively arrested and bailed and released.
Expensive.
Do you know what? Why don't we wait and see what the rest of the Prime Minister's statement says, and then we can digest it fully. But now we're going to look at something quite different. This is a headline from the BBC News website. It says, "Cost of living, the women doing sex work to make ends meet." And that reflects the fact that lots of charities who work in this area say they've seen an increase in the number of people approaching them because they are heading out into the streets to do this, to deal with the increasing cost of living, rent, electricity, bills, you name it. We can talk about this now with Nikki Adams, who's a spokesperson for the English Collective of Prostitutes. Thank you very much for joining us. Just give us a sense of what's happening out there.
Well, we've seen a big increase in the numbers of women approaching us, you know, contacting us, either for information about their rights because they're starting work or going back into prostitution, having left many decades previously sometimes. Most are mothers, and the kind of things that have pushed women back into prostitution or made them make that difficult decision to start are the fact that their food bill has gone up, their energy has gone up, their transport has gone up, they're more into debt, but also crucially, a lot of women are facing benefit sanctions. That's one of the big things that comes through our calls. And, you know, it's a really massive problem. It means that people are pushed to destitution levels and really are then entering sex work under very difficult and dangerous circumstances. And housing is also the other issue that we're seeing a lot of women calling us about, facing eviction, problem with their landlords. And the problem that we have is that if you go into prostitution at the moment, it's very difficult and dangerous because it's actually illegal to work together with another woman from premises, and it's also illegal to work on the street. So on the one hand, women are being pushed into prostitution because of the cost of living crisis and then are being criminalized for it. And that's why we're pressing both for measures to tackle the poverty that women and particularly mothers are facing, but also for an end to the criminalization that women face, so that we want decriminalization of women working on the street and together in premises. Okay,
so an argument for decriminalization, maybe even legalization, the next steps. Nimco?
Yes, decriminalisation, and I do support the Nordic model of criminalising the buyers as opposed to the women that are selling them. But I would also be very wary of us calling it sex work. This is prostitution. These women are coerced into it, and this is not consensual sex. So this is abuse and a form of violation that I see anyway.
Nikki, what is the difference between prostitution and sex work?
I don't know about that. I think what you just said about legalization, we don't want legalization, we want decriminalization. That's quite different. But I really do take issue with the Nordic model that's being pushed forward, because that fundamentally is increasing police powers against a criminalized and therefore vulnerable sector of women. And that's really problematic. You know, we have seen what's been going on with the police over the last few years, that they've been exposed as sexist, racist, and in some cases criminals themselves. And so to be calling for increased police powers at that moment in time is just completely unacceptable. They just did a survey in East London and they found that 42% of sex workers have actually experienced violence from the police. So if you call for increased police powers under those circumstances, you're actually putting women more at risk of harm. And so decriminalisation, the reason we're calling for it is not for some ideological reason. It's very practical. It means that women will be able to come forward and report the violence that they face instead of being fearful of arrest, and for those women who are migrant, deportation. You know, we're not interested in some ideological argument about what people feel about prostitution. The fact is that women are working in sex work right now. They're more increasing numbers.
Nikki, you made that point very clear.
So I'm a feminist and activist, and ultimately that's where my kind of feelings about prostitution come from. The fact that it's a violence against women and girls. I'm not asking for policing of women, but I'm asking for policing of men, and a different conversation to be had.
It's the same thing.
It is not the same thing. It is not the same thing.
It is the same thing. Ultimately, that's what happens. And if you are concerned about what's happening to women and girls, then you should be concerned, first of all, about the poverty and about the benefit sanctions that this government has imposed on people.
I am very much concerned about... Okay, I'm very much concerned about the poverty that women are in, but I'm not going to normalise an excuse that women being raped in order for them to get out of poverty. So ultimately, the reality.
You should be more respectful about women who are actually working as sex workers.
I am very respectful of women
as a form of earning an income.
Then go make your point.
Yeah, but prostitution is not sex work. Prostitution is abuse, and you and I can, disagree on that. But fundamentally, that's what it is. And I'm not going to stand here and say that in order for women to be able to lift themselves out of poverty, I should excuse their abuse. And I did not say that the police should be given powers in order to police women. I'm asking about policing. But that's not
what the Nordic model is.
But that's not what the Nordic model is. The Nordic model.
Criminalisation of sex work.
Well, the Nordic model is not about that. It's about policing those that buy sex and also policing gangs and also trying to start a conversation around the fact that men should be embarrassed in terms of actually buying sex. So ultimately, the reality is that prostitution is a form of violence against women and girls and something that we need to address. And I think it's massively problematic that you are standing here and saying that the fact that because we're living in this cost of crisis situation that we should be able to ignore women being abused. And I can't stand that. And that's... And I say that
I'm dealing with
as
a
somebody,
situation that I see right in front of me,
so
which is that women are already working in prostitution, working in sex work because of the cost of living crisis, because everybody's expenses have gone up. And when it comes to violence, I don't know what you think is going to happen.
But then let's have a conversation. But let's have a conversation and lobby the DWP. Let's not legitimise women being raped as a way to deal with this.
Women working in a flat together who were attacked by their landlord, and it's taken 6 weeks for the police to actually take a statement. 6 weeks. That's how seriously the police take violence against sex workers at this moment. So you calling for more powers to criminalise sex work in addition to that is not going to address the violence that sex workers are currently facing. We need a change in priorities. We need the police and the authorities to prioritise protection over prosecution. Women should be able to come forward and report violence without fearing arrest, and that's what decriminalisation would do. And we need the cost of living crisis dealt with specifically for sex workers' situation and for mothers. If the majority of sex workers are mothers, that is an absolute condemnation of the society that we live in.
Nikki, thank you. So, Aisha, everyone obviously cares about the people involved in this and why they're having to do it. But look at the massive differences of opinion about what to do.
Well, there's massive differences of opinions of everything in society. We live in the most polarised climate ever. I've actually met with Nikki and I debated many, many years ago, and I probably have closer views to Nimco, but I went to see Nikki afterwards and had a really interesting meeting. I met some of the women that Nikki represents, and I have to say it was really eye-opening for me because this was a number of years ago, and it just shows you actually how long the kind of poverty crisis has been in this country. And I remember Nikki sort of saying to me that actually because of the effects of austerity that actually a lot of women, and not just around London but across the country, were getting in touch with her and making these arguments. And I think the tragedy is we have a situation where, because the economy is going so badly wrong, because the people who are being punished are people at the most, the marginal ends of society. Poverty is often really kind of carried by women. Women are having to make these absolutely impossible choices. I was really struck when I went to Nikki, where she told me what is actually happening to these women. When you get into the details, we don't want to get into the details right now, they're really shocking. And you do think, in an advanced, rich country, how can we have a situation where women are literally being told it is easier for you to go really quickly when you've got childcare responsibilities and do something on the street rather than getting any help from the state? So I think that this should be, this shames our society, to be honest.
OK, Kit, you were a policing minister. You can now speak your mind completely freely. What do you think?
Well, I've thought for a long time, to be honest with you, that dealing with the, again, quite complicated problem of prostitution and the links between prostitution, drugs, abuse, organised crime, and disentangling that from other vulnerabilities that might drive people towards prostitution. Don't forget, men do it too. That actually it's much more of a social policy problem than it is a crime problem. In situations where we see children being abused, there's a social policy intervention, and in a situation like this, it seems to me that a social policy intervention around prostitution, identifying whatever the word might be, rescuing, helping, assisting women out of prostitution might be more productive than a crime-based approach. Now, having said that, decriminalisation, legalisation across the world, different things have been tried. I don't think there's one model that people point to that say this has either kept numbers low or has solved the problem. Very often there's a problem of driving it further underground, where more dangerous men are able to predate among women in particular, or indeed you get, like Spain, an overall growth in the sector which is also socially undesirable. So there's no solution, I think, from a crime and legislation point of view that's easy, but there might be from a social policy point of view. Now, I'd be very interested to see the data on this idea that more and more women are going into it because of hardship. If there is hard data, then I would urge the government to actually look at it quite closely, because obviously the women
it's
who
quite
get
hard to collate official data on this
well,
because it
I
is
understand,
in the shadows.
I understand, but these things can be done because if there is a growth, then it's definitely something that needs to be addressed.
Nikki, what sort of data could you provide the government that might urge them to do something?
Well, we can look at who's calling our helpline, and though the numbers of women calling our helpline is increased at least by a third from June. And the kinds of issues where we have documented it, the kind of issues that people are calling about are all cost of living issues. They are benefit cuts, they are housing, they are debt. You know, those kinds of issues where people are really struggling to make ends meet, particularly mothers. I mean, we have counted how many mothers it is that are calling. We now ask women about that, and it's over 70%, probably even more than that. And that is, as Aisha says, being the people that have been particularly targeted, both by austerity, but also by this cost of living crisis. And the crucial thing that we're finding is that, you know, particularly for mothers, they're absolutely terrified of coming forward and getting official help because they fear that their children will be taken away. And the rise in those kind of situations has also been very striking in the calls that we get.
OK, Luke, where do you and Labour stand on this debate?
Well, I share the concerns that have been raised here. I think we should be focusing on the people who are buying the sex, not necessarily the women and in some cases men who are part of that process. And I think this is deeply difficult. So let's look at the reasons behind it. And I think the cost of living crisis is affecting everyone in society, but it's affecting some groups much more than others, especially in our poorest communities. And that's where the effort to address the high bills, the stagnant wages, the spiralling house prices, that's forcing people out. Because this also relates to sex for rent. Because in many cases, it's not just people that are going on the streets in terms of dealing with providing sex for the cost of living crisis. It's people who are in abusive relationships with landlords having to provide sex to cope with still keeping a roof over their head. And so this is a much deeper, serious problem, which is a direct correlation of what's happening with the cost of living crisis and the failure to get to grips with it.
So much to think about. Nikki, thank you very much. Thanks for joining us today. Right, it's exactly 3 years ago since this guy said this.
To all those who voted for us for the first time, and those whose pencils may have wavered over the ballot, and who heard the voices of their parents and their grandparents whispering anxiously in their ears, I say thank you for the trust you have placed in us and in me, and we will work round the clock to repay your trust and to deliver on your priorities with a Parliament that works for you.
Just a few minutes left on the programme to comb through 3 years of very few events. Kit, you're good mates with Boris Johnson, at least I think you still are. 3 years well spent?
Well, it was certainly a rollercoaster 3 years, obviously dominated by the pandemic that sat right in the middle of it. And you know, although people look back now, it's kind of hazy, those early days. There was a brief period, you know, of about a month or 6 weeks pre-pandemic when we thought the world was our oyster and, you know, we were all set fair for a bright future. Sadly, an invisible enemy that attacked the whole world did for that, I'm afraid.
Nimco, you're mates with the Johnson family. You did babysitting for them.
No,
well, they said you did, but
yeah, exactly. Don't believe everything you read. So no, ultimately, I agree with Kit as well. The fact that I think COVID was a massive impact on that. But
what about Boris Johnson's character? Was he actually suited for that job?
He's a man that cares and really wanted to do well for his country. So I think he was suited for that role. Yeah.
Well, the history books will decide. Right, that's all for this episode of Politics Live. I'll be back with an episode of Newscast on BBC Sounds tonight. And Joe Coburn, you'll be pleased to hear, will be back in the hot seat tomorrow. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for watching.